For 10 years, the people of Ridgewater bought their vegetables from a ghost. Every Tuesday morning, crates would appear behind the general store. Tomatoes in summer, squash in autumn, potatoes and carrots and onions through the bitter winter months when nothing should have been growing at all. No one knew where the food came from. No one saw who delivered it. The crates were simply there, filled with produce fresher than anything that had a right to exist in the high mountain country, with a note listing fair prices and a tin box for payment. The town called it a miracle. Some said it was angels. Others whispered about deals with the devil. None of them guessed the truth, that the food came from a girl they'd driven into the wilderness to die, a girl they'd called a thief and a liar, and worse, a girl who had spent a decade building something impossible in the heart of the frozen mountain, and who had been feeding her accusers the whole time. Her name was Ellie Marsh, and this is the story of how she saved the town that had tried to destroy her. The trouble started with a horse named Blackjack, and a lie told by a boy who'd never faced consequences for anything in his life. Ellie was 15 years old in the summer of 1881, an orphan working at the Ridgewater livery stable in exchange for a bed in the hayloft and 2 meals a day. She'd been there since she was 11, since the fever took her parents and left her with nothing but a talent for horses and a stubborn refusal to give up. She was good with the animals. Everyone said so. Horses that spooked at shadows would calm under her hands. Colts that had never been ridden would accept a saddle within a week. The livery owner, a gruff man named Hollister, said she had the touch, that rare gift that couldn't be taught, only born. Sheriff Tom Garrett kept his horse at the livery, Blackjack, a magnificent black stallion worth more than most families earned in a year. The horse was the sheriff's pride, and he paid extra to ensure Blackjack got the best care, the best feed, the best stall. The sheriff's son, Wesley Garrett, was 16 years old and had his father's name but none of his character. Wesley was the kind of boy who pulled wings off flies and blamed the cat when things went missing. He'd been sniffing around the livery all summer, watching Ellie with an interest that made her skin crawl. "My daddy's horse likes you," Wesley said one evening, leaning against Blackjack's stall while Ellie tried to work. "Maybe I should like you too." "I'm busy, Wesley." "Too busy for the sheriff's son?" He moved closer, blocking her path. "That's not very friendly, Ellie. Not very smart either. A girl in your position ought to be nicer to people who could help her." Ellie looked at him, at his smirking face, his entitled posture, his absolute certainty that the world existed to give him what he wanted. "Move," she said. "Make me." So she did. She shoved past him hard enough to knock him into the stable wall, and she kept walking, and she didn't look back even when she heard him cursing behind her. It was the last free choice she would make for a very long time. 3 days later, Blackjack disappeared. The sheriff tore the town apart looking for his horse. He questioned everyone who'd been near the livery, everyone who'd been on the street that night, everyone who'd ever looked at Blackjack for too long. The whole town buzzed with speculation and fear. Horse theft was a hanging offense, and Sheriff Garrett was not known for his mercy. Ellie heard about the theft from Hollister, who woke her before dawn with a face like curdled milk. "The sheriff's horse is gone," he said, "and his boy says he saw you sneaking out of the livery last night around midnight. Says he saw you leading Blackjack out the back." Ellie's blood went cold. "That's a lie. I was asleep all night. I never—" "I believe you," Hollister said, and something in his voice told her that his belief wouldn't matter. "But Wesley Garrett's word against yours. Ellie, you need to run." "Run? But I didn't do anything." "I know. But the sheriff's already talking about a trial, and trials don't go well for orphan girls accused by the sons of powerful men." Hollister pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. "Take this. Take one of the horses. Not a good one. Something nobody'll miss. Go up into the mountains and don't come back until this blows over." "When will it blow over?" Hollister's silence was answer enough. Ellie ran. She took a dun-colored mare named Dusty, chosen because she was old and plain and nobody's favorite. She took the coins Hollister had given her, a bedroll, a knife, and a canvas sack, with whatever food she could grab in the dark. She also took a dog, a shaggy brown mutt named Copper, who had adopted her 2 years ago and refused to be left behind. They rode through the night, climbing into the mountains that rose behind Ridgewater, like a wall of stone and pine. The air grew colder as they climbed. The trail grew steeper. By dawn, they were higher than Ellie had ever been, in country where the trees thinned and the rocks thrust up from the earth like broken teeth. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't go back. The second night, a storm caught them on an exposed ridge. Lightning cracked the sky. Rain turned to sleet, turned to snow. Dusty stumbled on the icy rocks, nearly throwing Ellie into a ravine. Copper pressed against her legs, shivering, his brown eyes asking questions she couldn't answer. "I know, boy," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I know. We need shelter." She found it almost by accident, a dark gap in the cliff face, barely visible in the storm's chaos. Ellie dismounted and led Dusty toward it, hoping for an overhang, a shallow cave, anything to get out of the killing wind. What she found was so much more. The gap widened into a passage, and the passage opened into a cavern. And the cavern, Ellie stopped, stared, forgot for a moment that she was freezing and terrified and alone. The cavern was enormous, a cathedral of stone carved by water over countless millennia. The ceiling rose 50 feet overhead, studded with formations that caught her meager torchlight and scattered it like stars. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. It was warm. Not just not freezing. Actually warm, like a summer evening, like a heated house. Steam rose from somewhere deeper in the cave, and the air smelled of minerals and earth and something almost like growing things. Ellie led Dusty deeper, following the warmth, and found its source, a hot spring bubbling up from a crack in the stone floor, filling a natural basin before overflowing into a stream that vanished into the rock. The water was clean and clear and hot enough to steam. And beside the spring, in soil that had no business existing in a cave, there were plants. Not much. Some moss, some ferns, a few scraggly things she couldn't identify. But plants growing in the darkness, fed by the warmth and the mineral-rich water and the thin light that filtered through cracks she couldn't see. Ellie sank down on a boulder and started to laugh. She laughed until she cried, and then she cried until she was empty. And then she looked around at this impossible place and made a decision. She wasn't going to die in these mountains. She was going to live. The first year was survival. Ellie explored every inch of the cavern system, mapping it in her head, learning its secrets. The hot spring wasn't the only one. There were 3 smaller vents scattered through the caves, each creating its own microclimate of warmth. The main cavern had cracks in the ceiling that let in enough light for simple plants to grow. And a side passage led to a chamber with a natural chimney, perfect for cooking fires without filling the caves with smoke. She built a shelter in the warmest section, using driftwood she hauled up from a river valley miles away. She created a stable for Dusty in a side chamber where the mare could stay warm through the brutal winter. She learned which plants were edible, which animals could be trapped, which streams held fish even in the frozen months. Copper proved invaluable. The dog seemed to understand their situation with an intelligence that bordered on uncanny. He hunted rabbits and brought them back to share. He alerted her to dangers she couldn't see. He kept her company through the long, dark nights when loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. "We're going to make it, Copper," she told him one evening, huddled by her fire while wind howled outside. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to make it." The dog wagged his tail and put his head in her lap. By spring, Ellie had stopped merely surviving. She had started to plan. The idea came to her while she was tending the wild plants that grew near the hot springs. If these could grow in a cave, she thought, what else could grow here? She remembered her mother's garden back in Kansas, the tomatoes and beans and squash that had fed their family through summers that seemed a lifetime ago. She remembered helping to plant seeds, to tend seedlings, to harvest food that they'd grown themselves from nothing but dirt and water and patience. The cave had warmth. The cave had water. The cave had light, at least in the main chamber. The only thing it didn't have was soil. But soil could be made. Ellie spent the second summer hauling dirt from the mountain valleys, carrying it up in sacks she'd sewn from salvaged canvas. She mixed it with ash from her fires, with decomposed leaves, with the mineral-rich sediment from the hot springs. She built raised beds along the walls of the main chamber, positioning them to catch the light that filtered through the ceiling cracks. And in August of her second year, she planted her first seeds. She'd stolen them, the one actual theft she'd committed, slipping into a farm on the outskirts of Ridgewater while the family slept and taking a handful of seeds from their drying shed. Tomato, squash, bean, carrot, potato. Just enough to start. Just enough to see if her crazy idea would work. By October, she had tomatoes. They were small and pale. Nothing like the fat red fruits her mother had grown. But they were tomatoes, grown in a cave on the side of a frozen mountain. And when Ellie bit into the first one, the taste brought tears to her eyes. "We did it, Copper," she whispered. "We actually did it." The dog sniffed the tomato with interest but declined to share. He preferred rabbit. The third year, Ellie expanded. She built more beds. She experimented with positioning, discovering which spots got the best light, which ones benefited most from the hot spring warmth. She created an irrigation system using hollowed-out logs, directing water from the spring to her growing beds. She learned to save seeds, to rotate crops, to compost waste back into soil. Her underground farm grew from a single bed to a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more. She carved shelves into the cave walls for seedlings. She built a root cellar in a side chamber where the temperature held steady at just above freezing, perfect for storing potatoes and carrots through the winter. She created a drying rack over one of the smaller hot vents where she preserved tomatoes and beans and herbs. By her 4th year, she was producing more food than she could possibly eat. And that was when she started thinking about Ridgewater. She told herself it was practical. She needed things the mountain couldn't provide. Cloth, tools, salt, medicine. She had food to trade. It made sense. But late at night, when honesty came easier, she admitted the truth. She wanted them to know she hadn't died. She wanted them to see that the girl they'd cast out had survived, had thrived, had built something they couldn't even imagine. She wanted them to taste her tomatoes and wonder. The first delivery was terrifying. Ellie crept down from the mountain in the dark of a Tuesday morning, a single crate of vegetables strapped to Dusty's back. She left it behind the general store, a spot she'd scouted for weeks, hidden from windows, accessible from the alley. She left a note listing prices and a tin box for payment. Then she vanished back into the darkness before anyone could see her. She watched from the tree line as the sun rose, as the store owner found the crate, as he opened it and stared and called his wife to come look. She watched him hold up a tomato, perfect red, impossible in this high mountain town, and shake his head in disbelief. The payment was in the box when she checked 3 days later. Every cent she'd asked for. She made the delivery again the next week. And the next, and the next. The ghost market, people started calling it. Nobody knew where the food came from. Theories ranged from a secret valley to a mysterious hermit to actual supernatural intervention. The store owner, a practical man named Henderson, didn't care about theories. He cared about the fact that he had fresh vegetables when every other store in the territory was selling last year's withered potatoes. Ellie watched the town from a distance, learning its rhythms, its gossip, its changes. She learned that Wesley Garrett had been caught stealing from the church collection plate 2 years after she'd fled. The same year Blackjack had mysteriously reappeared, wandering in from the wilderness, the same year the sheriff had quietly stopped talking about the horse theft that had never been solved. She learned that some people thought she was dead. Others thought she'd run off to California. A few, a very few, whispered that maybe she'd been innocent all along. But nobody did anything about it. Nobody cleared her name. Nobody said, "We were wrong, and if Ellie Marsh is still alive, she deserves to come home." So Ellie stayed in her mountain. She grew her food. She made her deliveries. And she waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but she knew she'd recognize it when it came. The blight arrived in the summer of 1891, 10 years after Ellie had fled into the mountains. It started in the wheat fields, a strange rust-colored fungus that spread from stalk to stalk, destroying everything it touched. Within weeks, it had jumped to the corn, then the barley, then the vegetable gardens, the orchards, the root crops that families had been counting on to see them through winter. By August, there was almost nothing left. Ellie heard about it from the conversations she overheard during her nighttime deliveries, hushed, frightened voices talking about starvation, about families already going hungry, about the nearest help being 200 miles away over mountain passes that would be snowed in by October. She went home to her cave and looked at her underground farm. 30 raised beds overflowing with food, root cellars packed with enough potatoes and carrots and preserved goods to feed a small army. She looked at Copper, who was old now, gray around the muzzle, but still watching her with those trusting brown eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she asked. "Do they deserve it?" Copper tilted his head as if considering the question. They had cast her out. They had believed a lie over the truth. They had let a 15-year-old girl disappear into the wilderness and hadn't lost a moment's sleep over it. But they were also hungry. They were also scared. There were children in that town. Children who hadn't even been born when Ellie was accused, who had done nothing wrong, who would starve this winter through no fault of their own. And Ellie had food. More food than she could ever use. "Knowledge isn't like gold," she said softly, remembering something her mother used to say. "And neither is food. It doesn't get smaller when you share it. It just means more people get to eat." Copper wagged his tail. Ellie started packing crates. The first large delivery appeared on a Tuesday morning in September. 20 crates of vegetables stacked behind the general store like an answered prayer. Henderson stood in his doorway and wept. The second delivery came a week later. More vegetables plus sacks of dried beans and preserved tomatoes. The third included potatoes, enough to plant in the spring and grow more. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Every week. More food, more hope, more impossible abundance from a source nobody could explain. The price remained the same as always. Fair, affordable, listed on a note in the same careful handwriting that had appeared for 10 years. But now there was an additional note at the bottom, for the children, and the payment box began filling with more than coins. Letters appeared, thank you letters, prayers, desperate pleas for more, confessions from people who said they'd never believed in miracles until now. One letter made Ellie stop breathing. It was from the sheriff. "To whoever you are," it read, "you're saving lives. My grandson was sick with hunger until your food came. I'm an old man now, and I've made mistakes I can't take back. There was a girl years ago. Ellie Marsh was her name. We accused her of stealing my horse, and she ran. And I let her go because it was easier than admitting my boy had lied. She's probably dead now. Probably died alone in the mountains because we were too cowardly to seek the truth. I don't know why I'm writing this to a ghost who leaves vegetables. I guess I just needed to say it to someone. I'm sorry. I'm sorry she never got to hear it." Ellie read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box where she kept important things. Her mother's wedding ring, a photograph of her parents, the first tomato seed she'd ever planted. "He's sorry," she said to Copper, who was too old now to do much more than sleep by the fire. "He's finally sorry." The dog lifted his head and looked at her, waiting. "I think," Ellie said slowly, "it might be time for the ghost to show her face." She came down from the mountain on a Sunday morning, leading Dusty, old now, gray-muzzled like Copper, but still steady, through the main street of Ridgewater. She was 25 years old. Her hair was longer than it had been, sun-streaked and wild. Her hands were calloused from years of farming. Her clothes were patched and strange, partly sewn from salvaged fabric, partly made from animal skins she'd learned to tan. She looked like a creature from another world, because, in a way, she was. The townspeople stopped and stared. Conversations died. A child pointed and asked his mother who the strange woman was. Sheriff Garrett, old now, stooped, walking with a cane, emerged from his office and froze in the street. "Ellie?" he whispered. "Ellie Marsh?" "Hello, Sheriff." Her voice was steady. "I hear you've been wondering where your vegetables come from." The silence that followed was so complete that Ellie could hear her own heartbeat. "I didn't steal your horse," she continued. "I never did. Wesley lied because I wouldn't let him touch me, and you believed him because it was easier than questioning your own son. You drove me into the mountains to die, and I didn't die. I built a farm in a cave where no farm should exist, and I spent 10 years growing food that I sold to the town that cast me out." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And when the blight came, when your crops failed, and your children went hungry, I fed you. Not because you deserved it, but because I'm not the person you tried to make me." Henderson stepped forward, his face pale. "The ghost market. All this time, that was you?" "That was me." "But why?" The question came from somewhere in the crowd. Ellie couldn't see who. "Why feed people who hurt you?" Ellie considered the question for a long moment. "Because hungry children don't know anything about lies told before they were born," she finally said. "Because my mother taught me that food is for sharing, not hoarding. And because," she looked directly at the sheriff, "holding on to anger was going to kill me slower than the mountain ever could. So I let it go. I grew tomatoes instead." Sheriff Garrett was crying. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks into his white beard, and he made no move to wipe them away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. I think I always knew Wesley was lying. But he was my son, and you were just an orphan, a girl, someone who didn't matter." "Yes?" The word came out broken. "God forgive me, yes." Ellie looked at him, at this old man who had destroyed her life with his cowardice and his silence, who had let her disappear into the wilderness rather than face an uncomfortable truth. She thought about all the years alone, the cold nights, the fear, and the hunger, and the desperate early months when she hadn't known if she would survive. She thought about the farm she'd built, the food she'd grown, the life she'd carved out of nothing but determination and stubbornness, and the refusal to die just because someone wanted her to. "I forgive you," she said. The words surprised her as much as anyone, but as soon as she said them, she knew they were true. "I forgive you," she repeated. "Not because you deserve it, because I do. Because carrying that weight up and down the mountain was harder than carrying the vegetables, and I'm done with it now." She turned to address the crowd. All of Ridgewater, it seemed, gathered in the street to witness the return of their ghost. "The farm is still there," she said, "in the mountain, in a cave that stays warm all winter. There's enough food to get everyone through until spring, and enough seeds to plant new crops when the blight passes. I'll show anyone who wants to learn how to build what I built, how to grow food where food shouldn't grow, how to survive when survival seems impossible." She smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. "That's what I came down here to say. The ghost is real, and she's been here all along. and she's not going anywhere. They followed her up the mountain. Not all of them, but enough. Families who needed food, farmers who wanted to learn, young people who looked at the strange, wild woman and saw something they wanted to become. Ellie showed them the cave, the hot springs, the underground farm that had kept her alive for a decade. She showed them how to build raised beds and irrigation systems, how to position plants to catch the light, how to store food through the winter months. Henderson, the store owner, stood in the main cavern with tears in his eyes. "You built all this," he said. "A 15-year-old girl, alone in the wilderness, built all this." "I was stubborn," Ellie said. "And I had good teachers, even if they were just memories. My mother showed me how to garden. My father showed me how to work. And the mountain—" She ran her hand along the warm stone wall. "The mountain showed me the rest. What happens now?" Ellie looked around at the people filling her cave, her home, her sanctuary, the place she'd built from nothing when she had nothing. "Now we share it," she said. "Now we teach others. Now we make sure that the next time someone gets cast out with nothing, there's a place for them to go and skills for them to learn." She thought of the letter the sheriff had written, the confession he'd sent to a ghost. "And now," she added quietly, "we start over." 20 years after she'd fled into the mountains, Ellie Marsh stood at the entrance of the cave system that had become her life's work. Behind her, the underground farm had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. 3 caverns now, each one cultivated and productive, feeding not just Ridgewater, but half a dozen surrounding towns. A school had been built at the base of the mountain, where young people came to learn sustainable farming, cave agriculture, survival skills. Ellie's techniques had spread across the territory, adapted and improved by each person who learned them. Copper had passed 5 years ago, old and tired and ready for rest. But his great-granddaughter, a shaggy brown dog named Penny, sat at Ellie's feet now, watching the valley below with the same patient attention her ancestor had shown. Dusty had passed too, but her bloodline continued. Sturdy mountain horses bred for the harsh terrain, beloved throughout the region for their calm temperaments and sure feet. Miss Marsh, a young voice behind her, one of her students, a girl of 15 with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. "The new seedlings are ready for transplanting. Do you want to supervise?" Ellie turned and looked at the girl, at this child who could have been her 30 years ago, if things had been different. "You don't need me to supervise, Clara. You know what you're doing." "I know, but I like it when you're there." Ellie smiled. "Then I'll be there." She walked back into the cave, into the warm heart of the mountain that had saved her life and given her purpose. The main cavern was filled with green, rows of vegetables, climbing vines, the impossible abundance she'd coaxed from nothing but rock and water, and stubborn refusal to give up. Clara walked beside her, asking questions about irrigation, about seed saving, about plans for the spring. Ellie answered patiently, the way she'd answered 1,000 questions from 100 students over the years. "Miss Marsh," Clara said as they reached the tomato beds, "can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Do you ever regret it? Coming back, I mean? Showing everyone who you were?" Ellie considered the question. She reached out and touched a tomato plant, the descendant of the first seed she'd planted so many years ago. "I regret that it took so long," she finally said. "I regret the years I spent hiding, feeding them in secret, never letting them know the truth. I thought I was punishing them somehow, making them dependent on a ghost. But really, I was just punishing myself." "How so?" "Because I was alone. Because I had all this—" She gestured at the farm, the students, the life she'd built. "And nobody to share it with. The food wasn't the point, Clara. The food was never the point. The point was belonging somewhere, being part of something. Having people who know who you are and want you anyway." Clara nodded slowly, processing this. "The sheriff's son," she said. "Wesley Garrett. He died last year, didn't he?" "He did. Alone, in a boarding house in Denver. Never amounted to much, from what I heard." "Do you feel bad about that?" Ellie thought about Wesley, about the boy who had lied, who had destroyed her life for the crime of rejecting him. She thought about the man he'd become, the failure, the bitter ending. "I feel nothing about it," she said honestly. "He made his choices. I made mine. His choices led him to a boarding house in Denver. Mine led me here." She looked around at the cave, at the students working the beds, at the legacy she was building one seedling at a time. "I think I got the better deal," she said. Clara laughed. "I think you're right." They worked together in comfortable silence, transplanting seedlings, checking irrigation, doing the small daily tasks that kept the underground farm alive. Outside, the mountain rose cold and indifferent, the same mountain that had almost killed a 15-year-old girl 30 years ago. But inside, it was warm. Inside, there was food and laughter and purpose. Inside, there was everything Ellie had ever wanted and never knew she was looking for. "Miss Marsh," Clara said as the afternoon light began to fade. "Thank you for teaching me, for teaching all of us." Ellie reached out and touched the girl's shoulder, the same gesture her own mother had used a lifetime ago. "Thank you for learning," she said. "That's all any teacher really wants. Students who want to learn, who'll take what we teach and make it better. That's how knowledge works. It grows every time it's shared." Clara smiled and went back to her work. Ellie stood alone for a moment, looking at what she'd built. The farm, the school, the community, the life. She thought about the 15-year-old girl who had fled into these mountains with nothing but a horse and a dog and a desperate will to survive. That girl couldn't have imagined any of this. That girl had just been trying not to die. But somewhere along the way, trying not to die had turned into something else. It had turned into living, really living, in a way that the people who'd cast her out would never understand. "They said I stole a horse," Ellie murmured to herself. "But the only thing I ever took was my own life back." Penny, hearing her voice, padded over and pressed against her legs. Ellie scratched behind the dog's ears and smiled. Outside, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Another day ending. Another day survived. Another day of the impossible life she'd built in the heart of a frozen mountain. Ellie Marsh turned and walked back into her cave, into her farm, into her future. Behind her, the Ghost Market legend would live on for generations. The story of the girl who vanished into the wilderness and fed a whole town in secret, who turned betrayal into abundance and exile into belonging. But Ellie didn't think about legends. She thought about tomorrow's planting, next week's harvest, next year's students. She thought about growing things. She thought about home,